I hope you're sitting comfortably. Then I'll begin. Godfather Death, a folk tale from the Czech Republic, as told by Kevin Crossley Holland. One spring morning, Hannah gave birth to her 17th child. Soft green leaves shook on the beech tree. Green finches sang at the little window. The baby lay pink and blue and blissful in its cot, but Hannah wasn't so happy. "How can I be glad, Stepan?" she said. Stepan stood by his wife, smiling and sheepish. "You poor little thing!" cried Hannah. "How can we possibly feed you?" "Hey-ho," said Stepan. "How?" cried Hannah, "when all the others are so hungry?" "We'll manage," said Stepan, "one way or another." "You must find a godfather, Stepan," said Hannah, "someone fair and generous." "There's no one left," said Stepan, "no one left. Every man in the village is already godfather to one of our children." "But you'll have to find one," insisted Hannah. Stepan walked out of the village and into the forest, wondering what to do. "Yes," he said slowly, "I could. He might understand. All right, I'll ask the king." That evening, Stepan rapped his staff against the castle gate. First he had to wait a long time before one of the wardens came down to find out what he wanted, and then a nasty Rottweiler tried to bite his kneecaps. Poor Stepan! When he told the warden he wanted the king to be godfather to his new baby, the warden simply howled in his face and booted him out. "So that's the kind of welcome our king gives his subjects," said Stepan. "Well, I'll pay him back. One day I'll pay him back." Stepan picked up a twig and broke it into pieces. "Hey-ho," he said. "In this country the rich are rich and the poor are poor. Life is unfair." "And what," he said, "what am I going to do now about a godfather?" As the daylight failed and everything became blue, Stepan realized there was a man standing at his right shoulder, almost as if he were Stepan's own shadow. He was wearing an ashen cloak, and somehow his head looked a bit too large for his body. "Would I do?" said the man. He sounded as though no one had willingly said yes to him in all his life. "Do?" said Stepan. "As a godfather." Stepan gave a start. "Who are you?" he said. "You look so pale, pale as death." "I am Death," said the man. Then the two of them walked together. They walked and talked, and the end of it was that Stepan accepted Death's offer. "I'll come to the christening," said Death, smiling and nodding his large head. "You can count on me." Then he disappeared into the shadows. Stepan hurried home and told his wife what had happened. "After all," he said, "you have to admit Death's fair. He doesn't favour the rich and he doesn't favour the poor. No, he takes us all in his good time. You can't say fairer than that." "I'm not sure," said Hannah. "He'll make a good godfather." "But is he ever generous?" "We'll have to see about that," said Stepan. A few weeks later the baby was christened. Hannah decorated the church with wildflowers, and Death came and held the baby as he had promised. Stepan and Hannah didn't even have enough money to go to the inn afterwards to buy a drink for the villagers and their pale-faced guest. But the innkeeper, who was godfather to their eldest son, was a generous man. He invited everyone in and bought drinks for them himself. After a while, a fiddler struck up a squeaky tune, and many of the villagers began to dance. Death put a hand on Stepan's shoulder. "You've been a good friend to me," he said. "Cheers," said Stepan, and he hiccuped. "You have," said Death. "You've trusted me and invited me here. I don't have so many friends, you know." "I suppose not," said Stepan. "I'd like to give you a present," said Death. "You and my little godson may not have any money, but I can make you rich." "Rich?" "We can go into partnership." The fiddler fiddled, the villagers clapped and danced, they began to sing, and Death put his mouth to Steppen's ear. "So that's what I suggest," said Death. "If I'm standing at the foot of the bed, the person will recover. But if I'm standing at the head of the bed, there's nothing you can do about it. That person's mine." Steppen raised his tankard to Death, and Death raised his tankard to Steppen. "Do you understand?" he said, and he kept solemnly nodding his large head. "Cheers!" said Steppen. The next morning, Steppen nailed a notice to his cottage door. Just 3 words: Doctorus Medicus Fantasticus. "Nonsense!" said the priest. "He's never been to school." "His head's as thick as a loaf of bread," said the baker. "He doesn't know a thing about medicine," said Hannah. "I think he's gone mad." But when the tailor's little daughter cried that she had pins and needles all over, as if the elves were shooting at her, her mother was so desperate she carried her to Steppen's cottage and laid her on a bed. "I have a herb which may help," said Steppen. He chopped the herb and put it in a few drops of water and gave it to the tailor's daughter. At once, unseen to anyone in the cottage but Steppen, Death appeared. He was standing at the foot of the bed. How Steppen smiled! And when the tailor's daughter had swallowed the medicine, she sat up and smiled too. Within an hour, everyone in the village knew about the miraculous recovery of the tailor's daughter, and very soon all the villages for miles around got to hear about Steppen's astonishing powers. From far and wide, patients came to be cured. An old man with the shakes, and a woman with knots in her stomach, a little boy with devils in his head who kept tearing at his own face and arms and legs, and a girl who'd given up wanting to eat. Steppen welcomed them all to his tiny cottage and gave them all the same herbal medicine, and unseen to anyone but Steppen, Death was always there, smiling and sometimes nodding. He stood in his ashen cloak at the end of the bed. After being cured, each patient gratefully brought Steppen a present: 2 loaves of bread, a basket of eggs, a goose. Before long, Steppen and his family had enough and more than enough to eat. They were no longer poor. That summer, the king fell ill, and while apples and cherries grew thick-waisted on the trees, he became thinner and weaker, and no one could say what was wrong with him. The king's criers went riding from village to village, offering a great reward to anyone who would cure the king, and one of them saw the notice on Steppen's door. "I could cure him," said Steppen, "at a price." "But he's your king," said the crier. "My king once ignored me." "But he's so ill." "And my family was starving." "Name your price," said the crier. "When I wake up," said Steppen, "I want to see bags of gold swinging from my 2 apple trees. My well must be awash with wine. Yes, and I want a litter covered with gold cloth waiting at my gate." "Is that all?" said the crier grimly. "For the time being," said Steppen. The king's servants worked all night, and when Steppen woke up, he saw they had satisfied his 3 conditions. So did half the village, and quite a crowd had gathered by the time Steppen was ready to set off for the palace. The priest, the tailor, and the baker, the innkeeper, not to mention Hannah and her 17 children. "Drink the wine," called Steppen as he stepped into the golden litter, "and share out the gold. In this village, 1 person's sorrow is everyone's sorrow, and 1 person's fortune everyone's fortune." The king's servants carried Stepan through the forest to the king's castle. Then he was led to the king's bedchamber. "It's Dr. Stepan, your majesty," whispered one of the courtiers. "Doctorus medicus." "Fantasticus," said Stepan, smiling. Then Stepan, and Stepan alone, saw a figure with a pale face and ashen cloak amongst the courtiers. He was standing motionless at the head of the king's bed and scowling at the king. "Oh no," said Stepan, "not you." "What is it?" whispered the courtiers. "Not now of all times," growled Stepan, staring straight at Death. "What is it, Dr. Stepan? What is it?" "Never mind," said Stepan fiercely. "Never mind." Then he narrowed his eyes. "I have a herb here which may help," he said, "but even before that I want you to turn round the king's bed." All the courtiers frowned. The king's pharmacist and herbalist looked at each other. They raised their eyebrows and shook their heads. "Come on," said Stepan. As soon as his bed had been turned round, the king flapped a weedy, spotted hand and struggled to sit up. "Yes," he said, "much better, much better." "Dr. Stepan!" cried the courtiers. But then Death slowly walked from the foot of the bed to the head of the bed. The king put his hand over his eyes and fell sideways. "Again!" cried Stepan. "Turn it round again!" For a second time the courtiers put their padded shoulders to the king's bed and turned it round. For a second time the king sat up. "Yes," he said, "very much better." "Dr. Stepan! Dr. Stepan!" cried the courtiers. This time Death did not move. He looked grimly at Stepan. "I'll see you very soon," he said, or seemed to say, and with that he disappeared. "Long live the king!" cried the courtiers, "and long live Dr. Stepan!" On his way home that evening, Stepan walked into a storm. The whistling wind pinned back his ears and tossed leaves and twigs and even birds around the sky. Then the rain worked its way through Stepan's clothes, and he took shelter in the mouth of a cave. "That's that," he said. "I'll have to sleep in this cave." When he entered the cave, Stepan was astonished to see that it was bright with burning candles. On rock tables and ledges, and all over the cavern floor, there were thousands and thousands of lights, some quietly shining, some blue and quivering, some winking. "Aha!" said a voice. Then Stepan saw a pale face at the end of the cavern. "Welcome to my kingdom," said Death, smiling and making his way towards Stepan. "Your kingdom?" said Stepan hesitantly. "It certainly is," said Death. "Each of these candles is one life. Look! Some have only just been lit. Some have a long way to go. But you see this one?" Stepan stared at a candle that had burned right down to its wick, just a ghost of flame over a molten pool of wax. "That's the king," said Death. "I'll be collecting him later tonight." "The king," said Stepan. "When the flame goes out," said Death, "I go and fetch the body. The corpse belongs to me." "But there's nothing you can do about it," said Death. "First you live in your world and then in mine. That's how it is." Stepan sucked his cheeks. "Which is my candle?" he asked. Death didn't reply. "Which one is mine?" "Do you really want to know?" asked Death. Stepan nodded. Death pointed to a miserable little stub. It was burning brightly, but only had a very little way to go. "No!" cried Stepan. "Surely you can do something about it, can't you? We're partners, aren't we? And you're godfather to—" Then Stepan had an idea. He narrowed his eyes. "Look!" he exclaimed. "Up there!" While Death raised his large head and peered up at the cavern roof, Stepan grabbed a long candle and jammed it down over his own little stub. Then Death looked at Stepan. He saw Stepan's shining eyes and knew what he had done. "Pick up that candle," said Death. Stepan shook his head. "Pick it up," growled Death. So Stepan lifted the long candle. "You see what you've done?" said Death. "You stupid man! You've snuffed out your own life." Stepan scratched his head and sighed. "That comes of trying to trick me for a third time," said Death. "You stupid man! You could certainly have had a few days longer." "Hey ho!" said Stepan. Then he grinned, and stepping forward, he put an arm round Death's shoulders. "A few days more," he said, "a few days less. What's a few days between friends?" So Death opened his ashen cloak and drew it gently around Stepan. One spring morning, when the soft green leaves shook on the beech tree, Hannah gave birth to her 18th child. He lay pink and blue and blissful in the cot. Hannah wept and called him Stepan.